Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Slifkin, and I'm the author of Quitting Your Day Job, Chauncey Hare's Photographic Work, which was recently published by Mac Books. And I'm very happy to be here today with Josh Cohen, Erin O'Toole, and Sally Stein to discuss my new book. And before we begin, I would like just to introduce everyone. Josh Cohen is a professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths, University of London, a practicing psychoanalyst, and the author of numerous books and articles addressing a range of subjects from visual art, literature, and psychoanalytic theory. This alone would make him an ideal interlocutor for a discussion of Chauncey Hare. And in this regard, I especially want to mention his most recent book, Not Working: Why We Have to Stop, which considers the paradoxical dynamics of informing the drive to work and the desire to rest. In particular, the book's reflection on the artist as a privileged subject for the question of the boundaries between working and not working was a great inspiration for me as I was writing my own book and thinking about Hare's own vexed relationship and his to work and his identity as an artist. Erin O'Toole is an associate curator of photography at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and she has worked on a number of important exhibitions, including a major retrospective of Gary Winogrand and a truly revelatory show I was lucky to see last time I was in the Bay Area, Thought Pieces, 1970s Photographs by Lou Thomas, Donna Lee Phillips, and Hal Fisher. As I said about Josh, I couldn't imagine a better person to talk about Hare than Erin, as she has written and thought a great deal about Bay Area photography, as well as the history of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, which, like Josh is thinking about work in psychotherapy, touches upon a distinctly Harean nexus. And finally, I want to introduce Sally Stein, who is Professor Emerita at the University of California, Irvine, and who has written about a range of topics related to the history of photography, from 1930s documentary to the circulation of photographs in mass media magazines. Most recently, Sally published Migrant Mother, Migrant Gender, Reconsidering Dorothea Lange's iconic portrait of maternity, which came out in Mac's Discourse series in 2020. It's a book that in many ways brilliantly brings together many of the themes that have long preoccupied Sally's scholarship, such as the social agency of documentary photography, the crucial ways in which conceptions of gender inform cultural practices, and the circulation of imagery across various mass media platforms. Sally is also leading today's discussion, and so I'll now hand it off to her.
Thanks, Rob. I'm really interested in how you started your interest in Chauncey Hare, following as it is from books that you've published on Philip Guston and then on post-war American sculpture from wartime, the end of wartime, 1945 to 1975, the end of the Vietnam War or the war in Southeast Asia. It seems a little strange to me, like how you jumped then to Chauncey Hare. So maybe you'd start by telling us a bit about this genealogy.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I've had my toe in the water of photography for a long time. I mean, I practiced photography since I was a child, really. But we had a darkroom in my house, and so I've always been interested in it. And when I began teaching after graduate school, I kind of made a decision to always teach one course a year on the history of photography, because I felt that it was essential for students to know about photography, since it's kind of the lingua franca and the sketchbook of modern art. I would argue you can't understand modern art without understanding photography. So in some ways, even though I hadn't published on photography, it really began as a pedagogical commitment. And then I slowly began writing about photography, and I'm not even sure how it actually happened, but slowly I was offered commissioned essays, and I began to become increasingly interested in photography. As for my relationship to my previous scholarship, I would say that both previous books on Guston and post-war sculpture had, as a kind of larger methodological basis, questions about figuration and abstraction and reference. And I mean, that comes out of my own methodological commitment to as kind of social art history, and the idea that art is always referring to things in the world. even ostensibly abstract art. And that was something that became really a driving force, both in my work on Guston, who famously returns to figuration in his late work, and in these sculptures. It really came out of my interest in minimalism, which was, again, a kind of art that was supposed to be non-figurative, and yet for me was very much engaged with questions of technology and even questions of humanism. And so this idea of reference kind of, I think, the rubber meets the road, so to speak, with photography and reference, as Roland Barthes would say, the reference adheres to a photograph. And so I think in some ways, photography just is an expansion of this commitment of thinking about the ways that visual practices refer to the world. And in some ways, it's been crucial for my thinking about that. Now, for Hare, it has to do really with just a good friend of mine turning me on to him in 2009 when Steidl published the protest photographs. And he said, "Rob, you should look at this book, it's cool." And I looked at it, and initially it was the photographs. It just struck me as very powerful images, and maybe as someone who, grew up in the 70s, was born in the early 70s, there's that kind of uncanny sense of like seeing your childhood in those photographs. There's something uncannily familiar about some of the interiors of the photographs, but there was just the power of the photographs. But then it was also reading about his biography. And it was this kind of conjunction of the power of the photographs along with the story of his life about this chemical engineer who achieved a remarkable degree of professional success, for any photographer, receiving 3 Guggenheims, a show at MoMA, an Aperture monograph, all the while working as a chemical engineer at Standard Oil. And then after reaching this apex of success, deciding to quit his job, try his hand as a professional photographer by getting a Master's of Fine Arts degree at the San Francisco Art Institute, then being very much disillusioned by the art world twice over, first at MoMA, then at the Art Institute, unable to find a teaching job, no doubt in some ways because of his own disillusionment and surly idealism, we might call it, and ultimately having to go back to the working force, working as a kind of engineer at the Environmental Protection Agency in San Francisco, and then ultimately renouncing photography entirely somewhere in the 80s, although that's a contested question of when Hare actually does renounce photography. He does donate his entire archive, negatives, papers to the Bancroft Library at the University of California in 1999. And for me, I think the real clincher when I knew that this was somebody that I wanted to think about and write about was finding out that when he donated his photographs to Berkeley, he included this proviso in his in the bequest that said that anytime his photographs are reproduced, there has to be the following statement, which I'll read now. These photographs were made by Chauncey Hare to protest and warn against the growing domination of working people by multinational corporations and their elite owners and managers. I mean, when I read that, I thought, my man, actually, and then of course, and maybe we can talk about this as we go on, actually getting into Hare's archive and learning more about Hare from people who met him, I realized that, that idealism was in some ways vexed and compromised in really interesting ways, in ways that, in some ways made him an even more interesting figure. So, I would say it began as a visual, formal intrigue, which I think is often the case with research projects. And then, like a good research project, once you start pulling on the string, it just gets deeper and deeper. And with Hare, I told people, with the archive of Hare, it is the gift that keeps giving. Up to weeks before I submitted my manuscript, things were coming in that I didn't know about that deeply informed my my thinking, including this annotated copy of his first book, Interior America, which he gave to the photographer Russell Lee, which Lee then gave in his will to the University of Texas in Austin, which now is just in the open stacks at the University of Texas Library, not with Lee's papers. And I only discovered it because the photographer Alex Soth talked about it on an Instagram post. And then I reached out to Alex, who put me in touch with someone in Austin who turned Alex onto it. And, you know, and it was this incredible thing. And just as I was kind of racing against the wire to have the literally dozens of audio cassettes that Hare made throughout his life digitized, so I could listen to those. And, you know, hearing a conversation between Hare and the very important photo book designer Marvin Israel was an important piece of evidence that, again, you know, it just, I'm sure if I had another few years to dedicate to the work of Hare, there would be more discoveries. But, you know, one has to terminate one's work at some times. Although, you know, I might not be done with Hare yet.
Oh, good. Because
Yeah.
among other things, you've already just won. We learned on email today the historical research, historical photo book prize at Arles. Congratulations.
Yeah.
And you've actually opened so many issues in this first extraordinary biography and study of Hare's photography that I would love to see you do more as more comes to light. But you also didn't mention in these aspects of Hare that in the Berkeley archives, he stipulates that his prints can never, the prints he made and took so much interest and care with and are so extraordinary as prints that they must be locked up. They can never be seen again by the public. There can only be copy prints,
Yes.
which are always 2 or 3 to 10 notches down in quality and information from the original prints, etc. This is someone who really not just turned his back on photography in the last period of his life, but slammed the door on conventional photography and exhibition. I mean, he was not just an angry young man, but an angry man throughout his life. And it seems to me he really wanted to piss off other people at the same time. And there's a bit of Guston in that too. It seems to me there's some continuity between Guston really trying to, in his return to figuration, piss off America, piss off his viewers from all their conventional acceptances and compliances, and Hare doing something quite similar, even more extreme, for just saying to hell with photography at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more complicated than that in some ways. I think
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I want to kind of speak to a lot of, I mean, you raised so many interesting issues. I mean, the fact is you can see Hare's prints if you make an appointment at the Bancroft to see them. They're not totally locked away. I mean, but they can't be exhibited. And it truly is a shame. I mean, they are some of the most glorious black and white prints ever made. I mean, he was a chemical engineer and he knew his way around the darkroom. And then, you know, so they are truly remarkable prints as just craftsmanship. And so there is a kind of self-sabotage there. I mean, I think ultimately Hare wanted his work to be seen as social documents, not as artworks. And so there was a real reason behind it, right? He didn't want them to be fetishized, which they would absolutely be, because they kind of invite that sort of aestheticizing gaze. And so I understand that. And yet there is this kind of self-sabotage to Hare, who, and this is the point I wanted to make, that learning, kind of working through Hare's biography, you really sense this trajectory where he begins his career as a artist, as a photographer, wanting to make art, you know, making kind of Ansel Adams-like landscapes, very much in the tradition of art photography. And even when he begins his so-called documentary photography in the late 60s, he sees himself within the tradition of Evans and Walker Evans and the FSA, which is still a kind of aesthetic tradition, and I don't think Hare ever entirely gave up on that idea of being an artist. I mean, he says in his biography that this kind of tension existed in his undergraduate education at Columbia, where he decided to get a BA in humanities and a BS in engineering with this kind of sense. And I mean, this is something, and maybe this is something Josh has something to say about, but I didn't want to psychoanalyze him too much in writing a biography, but I do think ultimately Hare deep inside wanted to be an artist and felt like he couldn't do that. It wouldn't be a proper thing to do, and that his father wouldn't approve of it in the very kind of Oedipal sort of dynamics. And so he went into engineering, but he always felt the artist inside of him. And, I think ultimately, and this is going to sound a little bit petty, and I don't mean it to, but I think it's accurate, that Hare's disavowal of photography was in some ways a certain sour grapes, that he wasn't able to be an artist on his terms, which were very idealistic terms and very politicized terms. And rather than compromise, he just said, I'm not going to be an artist. But I do think that, even up to 1984, when he was still taking photographs, he still saw himself in some ways as an artist. And it was the disillusionment that the art world didn't, or the photo world didn't accept him, that in some ways led to his disavowal. I don't think it was an entirely, I think retrospectively he presents it as a kind of revelation where he himself disowns art. And I think there's some truth to that. I think he becomes, again, disillusioned with the art world, which he sees as corrupt, which it is, corrupted by corporate forces, corrupted by money, limiting what an artist can say within certain institutions. I mean, he's absolutely right about all of that. And yet, I think he was still committed. He still saw himself as a creative photographer. And, it was that kind of paradox of wanting to both be an artist, and be someone who has ideals, real ideals that both drove his best work and ultimately led to his disavowal. It's a contradiction, and there's no easy way to resolve it. And I think, Hare is ultimately somewhat of an untrustworthy narrator of his own life.
This
I was
morning,
just going to say that he imagined a lot of slights too, I mean, in terms of his interactions with the photography world, because I think, like you said in the beginning, he actually experienced a lot of success by most people's terms, in terms of receiving 3 Guggenheims, having shows at MoMA, having shows at SFMOMA, publishing books with Aperture, but he, like you said, he's his own worst enemy, and he undercut a lot of that with his behavior, and then blamed other people for what happened, and so I think that the self-sabotage that you're talking about, to me, was so evident in the way that he acted, especially with SFMOMA, because lots of photographers expressed frustration with John Tchaikovsky over the years. He could be very imperious, he could be unkind, that is clear. But when I was reading about his reactions to John Humphrey, who was the curator here at SFMOMA, somebody who by all accounts was a complete mensch. Everybody thought he was a great guy, and he was working with him on this project to do a show. But from your book, it seems that it was completely disorganized. He was fighting with the other photographers that he had brought in, et cetera. And that he decided that there was some sort of conspiracy against him, and then projected that onto his protests against SFMOMA. And so it just feels like anytime he got somewhere, he started to undermine that success by his behavior, and then saying, look, it's because of the content of the work, and I'm being, that people don't want to see this work. that's why I'm being censored or what have you. But actually, I think a lot of it was his behavior. When you read those essays that he wrote, the words that come up the most that really, are red flags are anger, fear, rage. He uses the word rage over and over again, and his wife in her essay in the protest photography book, talks about the fact that this was a problem for him, and so it's really tragic. It's really a heartbreaking story, because he kind of couldn't get out of his own way.
I do see Hare as a tragic figure, absolutely. And I mean, the title of my book, Quitting Your Day Job, is kind of an ironic acknowledgement of that, right? It comes from that old, I don't know where is it, if it comes from Broadway, don't quit your day job, right? Which is what they tell people who aren't that skilled, right? But Hare was skilled. That's not, but for him, quitting his day job was a curse. It was the moment that really he was stopped making his best photographs, right? More or less, all of the work that we associate with Hare's output was made while he was at Standard Oil, and the output more or less stops. He makes some work in this while he's at an art school in 78, 79, and a few small bodies of work, interestingly, in Silicon Valley in the early 80s, which was very prescient, but more or less, he needed that kind of agonistic relationship to the job he hated and which made him sick and nauseous in order to make this great work. And so it's a very tragic story that, he more or less when he got what he wanted, he couldn't do what he wanted to do. So there's a wonderful, again, it was a kind of a gift as a biographical subject, but one can't help but feel very sorry for Hare, because you sense that, even when he got what he wanted and all of these accolades, it still wasn't enough, or it actually led to his downfall as an artist in some ways.
The reference that you made, Rob, to his father and this sort of specter of a need for approval in the background is so interesting in relation to the kinds of behaviors, infuriating, antagonistic behaviors that Erin was describing, because you feel that what is always in the back of all these antagonistic encounters with individuals and institutions is a desperate plea or quest to be perfectly understood, so that there's a kind of furious narcissism actually at work from the very beginning, which at first seems to be quite creatively generative, as you say, that there's something about his work that can't recognize him, that can't contain and nurture his creative ambitions. But actually, what he can't see is that this perpetual state of being misunderstood is what he needs, and that when he moves into a space where, in a sense, he's invited to be himself completely, that seems to be when everything collapses.
Yes, I think that's right. And this kind of narcissist, paranoid aspect of his personality is so essential to the work. And I think one of the insights that I guess I'm most proud of, because I think it's the one that I was sensitive as I was writing this book, that Hare is a marginal figure within the history of photography. And writing this book, I wanted to make sure that it had something to say to those people who weren't particularly interested in Hare, and to think about larger issues about photography and larger issues about art's relationship to politics. And of course, I think on one level, it does that in terms of photography's relationship to work, which I write about earlier in the book. But at the end of the book, I think about photography's relationship to autobiography, and this idea that every photograph has this double dynamic of representing something in front of the camera and in some ways indexing the artist or the operator behind the camera. And this idea that another kind of fundamental paradox in Hare's practices, as he continually makes photographs of other people and claims that these are political statements about the alienation of workers, they're as much self-expression. There's always this attempt that somehow these are veiled self-portraits, just as in his final book, final work of art, perhaps, Work Abuse, How to Recognize It and Survive It, which I highly recommend everyone read. It's helped me in many professional contexts. That you realize as you read this book, which is filled with these kind of case studies and personal testimonies, that they're all, or most of them are veiled personal accounts of Hare's own experience as a worker, right? And this was a key, just as Hare's own citations of the renegade, if we want to call it, anthropologist Carlos Castaneda, who may or may not have engaged with a indigenous Mexican what would be the word to describe Don Juan? Guide, yeah, or right. That there was something about this idea of fictional autobiography that seemed really important to Hare, in particular in relation to his commitment to documentary, right? So this is one of these ironies or paradoxes of Hare's practice, is that he's working within these genres that are ostensibly empirical, documentary, self-help, psychotherapy, and yet they're pervaded with both forms of subjective self-expression and fiction, right? Forms of aesthetic manipulation, which is not a criticize them, right? It's rather just the inevitable dynamics that inform any compelling statement, right?
But it is a little frustrating to me to hear him say, I care so much about these working people to the extent that I'm not going to sell this work. It's about me sharing their values. I, have so much respect for them. He does not name them in the pictures. Their names are not in the titles. In Interior America, for example, you read that essay, there's precious little about those people and what he's doing and what that protest actually is, and so when you read, I just, reread it because of, this conversation. I hadn't read it for a long time, and I was just really struck by the confessional aspect of it and how he had to go into every, lurid detail of his life, at the same time professing that this work is about helping, working people. And if he hadn't been claiming that, and he just, had that essay, it would be different. But it just felt like, if that's what you were doing, wouldn't you put more effort into actually doing something to help them? It feels like there's this contradiction that's at the center of all this, that it's actually all about him, and the pictures themselves, often the subjects are kind of incidental to all of the stuff that surrounds them too. They get kind of lost in these pictures, and so that to me was so striking when I reread it, because I think the pictures are incredible. They're the details and his ability to bring so much into the frame is really unsurpassed. But then I just felt this frustration with him, not being able to quite pull it off. And that's how I felt with a lot of these things, is that he had there was some muddled thinking that made it so that he couldn't quite make, the protest against the museum work out, because he muddled it up with other things. And he's so obsessed with his own stuff that, was he actually really doing what he set out to do or claims to set out to do?
Yeah, well, I think part of that has to do with a kind of progressive and belated recognition on his own part of his practice. That's to say that it's only around 1974, 75 that he becomes politicized, and that he realizes that these photographs that he's taking of working people in California and the Ohio River Valley are in fact political documents, that they're not just aesthetic kind of Walker Evans-esque portraits, that's understandable. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that, that he's learning through practice, and that his own practice is teaching him about this kind of alienation that he himself experienced as a worker, right? So some of that has to do with this kind of belatedness. And then, of course, the actual experience of trying to show his work at MoMA. And by the time the MoMA show in 1977 happens, he has begun photographing at his workplace in Standard Oil, which are, I think, this kind of confluence where his politics and the imagery meet. Mm-hmm. And Sarkowski refuses to show those photographs. And then Marvin Israel and, I forget the Hoffman, is that right? Michael Hoffman of Aperture refused to include those in Interior America. And so again, going back to an earlier point, there's kind of this little intimation of truth to Hare's paranoia and rage, right? That he did make these photographs that were moving towards a more political statement, still, not that political when you put them alongside someone like Hans Hocke's work or Alan Sekula's work, but he's moving in that direction, and the institutions resist it, right? So he has just enough reality testing to kind of substantiate his paranoia. But I think, ultimately, I think it's true that, there is, as is true maybe of all photography of people, maybe someone like Aurelia Azoulay would say, it is kind of manipulative, that he is using these people to make art, right? That's a fact, just as Dion Arbus did, just as Walker Evans did. I would say that Hare's photographs are less manipulative than Arbus's. Maybe, I think there's more empathy in Hare's photographs than in Arbus's, but that doesn't make them better or worse. It's just a different attitude. But it's absolutely true. And again, what comes through in his 3 autobiographical statements is his own sense of guilt, that he's aware of this. He knows that he's using these people to make art. And moreover, as I write in my book, he also knows he's doing it under slightly false pretenses, right? That he's telling them that he is a photographer working for the Library of Congress, right? He's showing them this binder he has of introductory letters from state senators. He's using all of this kind of credentials to gain access, which he knows is slightly manipulative. And again, to me, that's a virtue,
But he's railing against the man, and then he's like playing the man in order to like make the picture.
Yes, well, absolutely. This gets to
when it serves him,
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think this is another kind of Oedipal dynamic that I think Hare shares with a lot of artists who shared his subject position in the post-civil rights era, which is to say that he was a liberal white male who was sympathetic to the liberation movements of the 60s, and yet was not willing to do what would be the most radical thing, which would be to cede his position of authority and let others speak, right? And this relates to a kind of future project where Hare is going to play a role in, which is, thinking about, to understand the kind of dominant aesthetic paradigms of the 60s and 70s, the minimizing gestures of conceptualism, as in some ways of almost managing, if not legitimizing, the hegemonic subject position of the white male in the post-civil rights era, right? That the kind of the unseemliness, even the kind of ugliness of Hare's photographs are somehow registering that vexed situation that he finds himself in.
But also speaking to, in his vision, how small most white figures are in the gestalt, the landscape that he creates. It seems to me that mentioning Arbus is a great sort of opposition, because her figures fill the frame. And as Erin suggested, the figures that he depicts are very slight. They're almost swallowed up by the interiors. as
Yeah.
I think he felt himself to be swallowed up by his environment.
This is one of my favorites, where it's not just that the figures are kind of small, but they're cornered, and then kind of restrained by this truly absurd phone cord, that it acts as a kind of stanchion, right? That, and then, yeah, the unseemliness of the stain on the carpet floor, this sense of, as I say in my book, that there's this kind of miscarried attempt at bourgeois decorum going on in these photographs.
I went back and read Vicki Goldberg's review of the book from 1979, which I thought was a really good one. And she talks about exactly what you said, Sally, about the difference between Evans and Hare. And she said that, I wrote it down, the quote, she said that Evans let the interiors substitute for people, but never swallow them. And she talks a lot about the combination of the wide angle lens and the large format camera, and how that enables you to see in the frame more than your eyes would naturally see, and that this becomes sort of disorienting, and she equates it with watching the news on television and everything sort of coming at you, and in the end sort of says that that style, that sort of what she called a disarray, it was really itself a comment on the times too, which I thought was a very astute way of thinking about it, and just this like inclusion of everything, and everything sort of leveled and having the same weight, the people, the stuff, the scene, and I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it.
I would add about that this picture in some ways is exceptional for at least giving a kind of larger family, an extended family, whereas one really has the sense of a kind of the loneliness of these isolated solo figures or twos or threes in most of the pictures.
Yeah, and
I still find it kind of a lonely picture, though.
Oh, you find it a lonely picture?
Yeah, because it makes me think of what you say at the beginning of the book and then throughout about the imbrication of work and home. That really it feels like an exemplary bit of self-portraiture again, that what he is describing in this photograph is his own sense of there not being a space where you're not hemmed in, corralled by the discipline of a kind of work culture, that you feel that there's a kind of chilly interchangeability about this family, that actually, although they're very distinctive in their bodies and their faces, for me there's also a feeling that they're living this sort of tract life where you could almost pick up these figures from one of those kind of dollhouse and replace them with some other figures.
Yeah, and in so many of Hare's greatest photographs, there are these uncanny doubling, right? So you have the two children with the same smiley face T-shirt, and then the two children on laps, that I can speak to this sense of interchangeability. And of course, that is even more explicit in other photographs from the series as well. Yes, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, what I notice here and in many of the other ones is the great distance that he has between him and the subjects. He shows a lot of carpet in these pictures. There's like just this like miles of carpet, and it's like he is isolated and alienated himself from these subjects, even when it's a scene that's a warm scene compared to a lot of his other ones. He is very far away from this, and he sort of crammed them all into this corner, and that cord is sort of suggesting how far away he is from this kind of a life.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was easy for Hare to do this. I think he was a somewhat shy, withdrawn person. And at the Bancroft, they actually have his logbooks from the Guggenheim, where he talks about having to return repeatedly to certain people to convince them to take the portraiture, you know, that so much of the kind of artistry is, or the aesthetics, we might say, the semblance of these works has to do with the weird psychological dynamics that are occurring between Hare and the subjects, right? His own awkwardness that is somehow shaping the way these photographs look. I think that's right.
Yeah. And I don't think Evans was a warm person himself, but he gets up close to his subjects, you know, who he has like there's a huge gulf between his life experience and the people he's photographing, you know, during the Depression, but he gets right up, you know, that's close to them.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and of course, Evans also photographs interiors. It's not that that's not something he does as well, but I mean, that goes back to Goldberg's insight, right? That the interiors don't swallow up the figures the way they do in Hare's photographs.
As I'm reading your book, first of all, I was so impressed with how you were able to jettison whatever frustration you might have felt, and with great equanimity, be able to describe his own struggles and his sort of major rejections, renunciations, including photography, especially photography, it seems to me, because it obviously brought him great satisfaction initially, and then he really turns away from it. He rejects it completely, or at least that's, I mean, I kept wondering, did he not take any more pictures after he sort of formally renounces it? But he did take landscapes with his wife after he renounces it. That much we know. Okay.
But I mean, there are, as one of the joys of this project was reaching out to people who knew Hare, and certain people who knew Hare said that he even into the 90s would reach out to, they would bump into people on the street in San Francisco, kind of Diogenes-like, and still searching for one other photographer who had integrity. You know, that certain people remember seeing Hare in the 90s after he avowedly forswore photography. He's still trying to find someone to talk photo with. So it's, you know, it's not so clear cut. And, you know, even the interviews that he gave in 2000 when he donated his materials to Bancroft suggests that he's still hoping that people recognize his achievement, right? It's not as if he's totally disconnected from his photography, even then.
He could have burned his prints, his negatives, just said enough,
That's right.
but he did not do that. He, in fact, entrusted it to Jack Von New and special collections at Berkeley. But as I'm reading it, and I am getting frustrated, sort of like, no, don't give it all up. Find a way through these contradictions. I kept wondering, was there a singular turning point or pivot or straw that broke his back? And for me, I wondered whether it was mirrors and windows, and this gets back to what you were previously talking about in terms of photography being both objective and very much a self-portrait, autobiographical. And in Sarkowski's formulation, which of course recalls what Lukács called the bourgeois antinomies, whether this polar classification freaked him out, that he ends up on the window side, whereas he was actually trying to find something that would integrate a sort of spirit and matter, objectivity and subjectivity. So I wondered if you thought mirrors and windows, which he also then defaced a copy and sent it back to MoMA, and which Susan Kaczmarek interpreted as, could this be like possibly a kind of bomb threat or some kind of crazy
threat? I do have that we can look at, which is, yeah, truly, this was another one of these kind of remarkable discoveries while working on this project, you know, to discover that Hare sent this copy of the Mirrors and Windows catalog to MoMA. His anger at being included in this show And yeah, it looks almost like a ransom note, right?
Yeah.
Where he sends, he's ripped up, he's drilled a hole through it. He's asking Sarkowski to answer this petition that he sent, where he's asking the museum to actually return the 4 photographs that the museum had purchased back to him, right? The only 4 photographs really that any museum owns of his work, with the exception of the Library of Congress. Does SFMOMA own any Hare photographs?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
no, I think those were the only ones that he sold. Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, this was an amazing object. And truly, you feel the rage. It really is a frightening thing. And I interviewed Susan Kismaric as part of my research, and she said having this thing fall out of an envelope was frightening, because you think, is this guy waiting outside on the sidewalk to get Sarkowski? It's that kind of level of anger. And I think you're right. I have pictures. Here's Hare handing out his awareness guide to the Mirrors and Windows exhibition at SFMOMA, and that Mirrors and Windows was absolutely the breaking point. Was it because somehow unconsciously that dichotomy of an artist, a photographer, as either a window objective photographer or a mirror subjective photographer somehow touched that nerve? I mean, Hare I don't think ever articulated that, but I love the idea that somehow it was that dichotomy that finally broke his back, because that was the dichotomy that he couldn't reconcile. I mean, ultimately, I think it was just the sense that his work was being misrepresented, that ultimately Sarkowski chose the most aesthetic of the 4 photographs in their collection, the one without people, to include in the show. That for him, it was just the epitome of this kind of aesthetic defanging of his work that he felt he had to protest. And the fact that Mirrors and Windows was one of the first major exhibitions with a corporate sponsor, Philip Morris, which again is very prescient and aligns him in ways that he would never have recognized with an artist like Hans Haacke. And again, makes me very sympathetic to Hare.
He also was, I think, protesting not just the aestheticization, which I think is key, but also this lack of control of how the work is shown. That he, like you talked about, that which was my feeling all along, is that like if he couldn't be accepted on his terms, then he's taking his toys and going home. There was no compromising, and so this was just an affront because he's not consulted. It's not, it's not the way he wants the work to be shown. And as I said earlier, the thing that frustrated me so much about the protest against Philip Morris, which is such a good one, like if it had been just really clear that he's protesting against this corporate sponsorship by this terrible company, it would have been much stronger. But he undercuts it with all this, gobbledygook about conspiracy theories around SFMOMA, canceling his show because of the content of the work. And so it's to me, I just feel like, oh, you could have like made it so clear and about that, but then it always has to come back to him being slighted, and so that just makes me a little crazy, I have to say.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
It feels like there's this predicament that haunts him through the course of his career as a photographer, around renunciation, and particularly renunciation of the aesthetic. And this is what gets him perpetually into trouble with himself. This is why he can't stop railing against the world. That renunciation of the aesthetic always involves a kind of a gesture of purification. And when you purify, in a way, you get drawn back into the aesthetic. There's a way in which he's always trying to get rid of some art element, and instead he amplifies and accentuates it. It feels like the more you renounce art, the more artful the photography becomes.
Yes, or I would even argue that as he renounces the aesthetic, things like his protest become a form of performance art, or this defaced copy of the catalog becomes a strange Dadaist collage in ways that he wouldn't even recognize, but that absolutely is true. And as he becomes more and more committed to New Age spiritualism and Buddhism, I think that he starts taking these self-portraits of himself in the lotus position, that he's aestheticizing himself in some ways, I think.
But then also that cover, also looks like it's kind of outsider art. It made me think of Valerie Solanas, actually, particularly the bullet hole.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yes,
the kind of male counterpart.
Yes, I mean, a whole theme that I kind of touch on lightly but don't get deep into is Hare's kind of gender politics. The fact that he writes on the cover of this catalog, "Windows to Emasculation," right? That he uses this term emasculation. And on the cover of This Was Corporate America, there's this photograph of a man jumping out of a window from the Social Security building, who my research discovers, although Hare doesn't mention it, was a gay man who felt constrained in his life, and so there are these weird moments where Hare seems to be kind of both railing against a kind of emasculation and at the same time aligning himself with non-normative male subjects, and it's not something I was able to kind of go much further in, but I think it's important in terms of what you just said.
And going back to the idea of renouncing, the aesthetic side is, he could have gone to other kinds of venues to show his photographs. He didn't have to go to the Museum of Modern Art. He didn't have to publish with Aperture. He could have self-published. He could have shown them in a community center. He could have done all these things. So, if that was really the goal, was to do those things, he could have rejected it in that way. But that's not what he did. And that to me is very telling, because it was actually really important to him to show at MoMA, to have that, that kind of credibility, because he talks from very early on about wanting to be important and to do something important, and having that, whether these were his father's values or what have you. He gives up when it doesn't work out at MoMA. He doesn't go somewhere else. It's like, oh, well, that didn't work, so
But isn't a fantasy that it won't be MoMA that changes Chauncey Hare? It'll be Chauncey Hare that changes MoMA. He will turn MoMA somehow into a kind of anti-art institution. Mm-hmm. And when the craziness of the idea doesn't work, in a way, where else is there to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he says, as he gets more politicized, that the reason he wants the MoMA show is because of the credibility it will give him with Standard Oil, right? And I think what you just said, Erin, is so right. Or both Josh and Erin said, is that he sees his practice as somehow, he wants to change the world. It's deeply romantic. I mean, that's ultimately, I see her as a kind of tragic romantic who is committed to a very, grandiose idea of the aesthetic. The epigraph to Interior America, to those who are awakening to their own authority. Right? I really kind of wrestled with that sentence for a long time. On one level, it makes a lot of sense, right? Here are these dispossessed, alienated people, and his hope is that they can wake up to their authority and resist the multinational corporations that are exploiting them. And yet at the same time, the idea of awakening to one's authority suggests that you become your own authoritarian force, right? That there's no liberation in that it's just a new form of oppression in some ways. And again, this is one of these tragic aspects that I think, Hare was so deeply committed to this romantic idea of art that would change the world. But that itself comes with a certain kind of authoritarian complex, as opposed to the kind of Cagean aesthetics that were more or less developing alongside of Hare's photography that, certainly didn't have this an overt politics, but one might say a politics that was more aligned with the civil rights movement and feminism, that wasn't so dominant in some ways, or domineering, right? Hare, Hare wanted his art to have real agency, and I think that ideal set him up for disillusionment. And I think it's, maybe we can end, I see we're coming to our end, we can just end thinking about his kind of second act as a clinical therapist, as a kind of movement away from one realm of where he could affect life. He wanted his photographs to change institutions and lives, and he moves it into a kind of personal context where he might be able to help workers rather than, on a one-to-one basis, and that, kind of personal politics.
And he doesn't have to have a boss,
Very true. Yeah.
So he finds a calling where he doesn't have to, compromise and do all those things that were so hard for him in an institutional context.
And he's able to work from home.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable fact that he did have a home office in San Francisco for most of his career as a therapist, and then was on the forefront even in the 90s. And maybe this speaks to his setting in San Francisco of email therapy, teletherapy. He was on the forefront of that with this small group of social workers and therapists who were particularly working with people in corporate settings who would correspond via email about their exploitative experiences. And I spoke with some of these people who worked with Hare, and it was, someone who's been academia and nonprofit settings, it was truly shocking to hear people talk about corporate work settings and how they are kind of militarized, in terms of hierarchy. And, it was so foreign to my own experience as a worker. And, you start to realize that, again, Hare was truly, he wasn't that paranoid, right? There was some truth to his experiences, and they're worth taking seriously.
It's the Woody Allen, I think it's Woody Allen, is that even paranoids have real enemies.
Yes, right. Yes. Well, Hare certainly had real enemies. Yes.
This seems like a good place to end. And I think it's going to lead to lots more thinking about an investigation of Hare, but also about people who sort of hit the wall with photography. I mean, it also made me think of how many people have had a great presence in photography and then turned their back on it. In some, throughout the 19th century, there are people who actually sometimes turn their back on painting and become studio photographers, etc. But I was also thinking about Peter Henry Emerson finally deciding that his theories about how pictorialism might be the most natural way of seeing and depicting seeing didn't really pan out. And he really sort of recognized the way the eye works really requires something more kinetic than photography, than any still image. And he sort of turned his back on photography.
I still in billiards, doesn't he?
What?
He then dedicates his life to billiards, I think.
Oh, I actually
I'm making that up.
I don't know. It makes me want to check this out, but also to think about others who have sort of progressed, advanced photography, but then turned their back on it. Sort of how the limits of the medium may lend itself to certain kinds of dichotomies and antinomies that then require people moving to film or to writing or to something else altogether, in this case toward therapy of work abuse in an interpersonal context, etc. Finally, I want to congratulate you again on this first of what may be many awards for this really pioneering study.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Erin and Josh, as well, for participating in this conversation. I feel like, I always say, don't start me talking about Chauncey Hare, because I could talk all day. I mean, and he is really a fascinating subject. His work is really so powerful, and it does deserve more attention. And I hope this book gives it the attention it deserves. So thank you all, and thank you everyone at MAC for hosting this conversation. And I hope to see all of you in real life someday.